Don't move the anything.
Jakshi, are you there?
I'm live. I'm online.
Jakshi Gopal, are you there? So Kurma Prabhu, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So we are live, and I believe that something is going on in Mayapur with our internet connection. There's Shakshi. Okay, good. A little bit of technological problem. Shakshi Gopal Prabhu, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's better. The light's better as well.
I guess we're good to go. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Vanchakalpatarubhascha Kripasindhubheva Patitanang Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah.
Hare Krishna. So you are a famous devotee. And I think a big part of your fame is your cookbooks. I own them, and I think pretty much everybody owns them. So congratulations to a lifelong service dedicated to Prasadam. I'm sure you've done other things. I see on your board behind you all kinds of schedules and everything. You have a very busy office. Where are you right now?
I'm in County Wicklow in the Republic of Ireland, in the woods, in a cottage.
So you moved from Australia. You're the place of your spiritual birth, huh?
That's right. I spent 50 years in Australia, from when our family migrated there in 1964, and then in 2015, I started a new life in Europe.
Fantastic. So we're, of course, doing this as part of the GBC strategic planning team.
Correct.
And what we have done during the COVID period is a couple of things. One thing is just to continue to warn people about the danger of COVID. And right now, in certain jurisdictions, it's more dangerous than ever. And, you know, our hearts go out to the devotees currently in India that are particularly suffering, but in other areas of the world right now, there's also some pretty severe suffering. So we just encourage everybody, follow good, safe distancing, wear masks, and be careful. Many, many, many devotees have passed away during this period of time. It's quite serious. The second thing that we've been doing is, let's say, generally has been in the devotee care kind of thing. Interesting interviews on different very fantastic topics. Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada's disappearance day, the inauguration of the first corporation, as well as just general topics of interest. And so we've been broadcasting it, and it came to our attention that 50 years ago, Srila Prabhupada arrived in Australia for the first time. And so we thought, well, okay, there's the famous Kurma Prabhu. You were there. We're going to interview Charu Prabhu, who was the temple president then at that time when Srila Prabhupada arrived. So we're going to interview him tomorrow. And we just want to basically hear from you. Tell us first about who you were then, and then leading up to Srila Prabhupada coming, and then his arrival. Tell us something about this.
Right. Well, I just left school. I was a school leaver. I was 18 years old. Our family had migrated from England in 1964, and I found myself going to high school in Australia. And one of my school friends at the time, whose name was Mark, who later became Mahaprabhu Das at the first initiations, he invited me to come along to the temple, which had just opened up in Sydney, in Australia. About the same time, miraculously, other things happened. I was going to a youth group in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and I arrived one day, but they had moved the venue and the room was completely empty. There was nothing in the room except a Back to Godhead magazine, brand new Back to Godhead magazine, lying in the middle of the floor, which I took home and read cover to cover many, many times. And at the same time, my mother was working in a handcrafts of India shop in Sydney. And one day, the first devotee to join in Australia, who was actually from Southern California, his name was Upananda. You might know Upananda.
Upananda, yeah.
And he was traveling the world at that time, and he had joined the temple. And he was the first devotee to join. And he walked into the shop to buy some vases for the temple, for the altar. And my mother sold him the first set of vases. And then she came home, and I came home from school, and she said, I met a monk today. And I said, oh, really? Was he from Tibet? And she said, no, he was from Southern California. And I thought, oh, that's very unusual. I didn't put all these things together at first. And then my father was working downtown in a place called Martin Place, and he was taking the train home after a busy day at work, and a glimmer of yellow caught his eye, and there was Upendra, who was standing there selling Back to Godhead magazines. Actually, he wasn't selling Back to Godhead magazines because they'd sold them all. All they had left was one-sided sheets of paper called What is the Sankirtan Movement, which they roneoed and copied out. And Upendra handed one of these sheets to my father. My father reached out and took it, and then Upendra hung onto it, and my father hung onto it, and there was a little tug of war. And then Upendra leaned over and said, could you give us 20 cents donation? And my father was horrified. My father had this complaint of he had short arms and long pockets, as is described. And he was very reluctant to hand over 20 cents, but he did. And he gave a donation, and he brought this piece of paper home, and he gave it to me. So now I had a Back to Godhead magazine. I had this piece of paper all about the Maha Mantra. I stuck it up on my wall. And then my friend Mahaprabhu, Mark at the time, invited me to the temple. So all of these things were happening at once. I went to the temple. I started taking prasadam and attending the temple. At that time, Charu and Vaibhavi had just moved in. He'll tell you all about that wonderful pastime tomorrow. The first devotees to come to Australia actually were Upendra and Balimadan. Whole backstory to that. Originally, Chidananda Das, Brahmachari, in 1968, he wrote to Prabhupada, because so many temples were being opened at the time. There was this a sense of a great adventure where everybody was trying to go out and open temples. This was a great push for spreading the Krishna consciousness movement worldwide. So way back in 1968, he wrote a letter to Prabhupada and said, I would like to go to Australia to open a temple. And Prabhupada said, wonderful. And he sent him so many encouraging letters. I've got all this information in the big storybook here, The Great Transcendental Adventure, which is 800 pages of nectar about the history. But he warned him that he would have to take the proper precautions in getting a visa to go to Australia. And
let me just interrupt for a moment. Where can we buy that book? Is this a book you just published?
No, it's been out for 25 years, but it's
25 years. Okay.
It's available from the Sydney BBT. If anyone's interested in purchasing this, they can send me a message on Kurma dasa at gmail.com, and I'll link them up with the
beautiful. All right, please continue. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's okay. It's a good read. So Chidananda didn't take the necessary precautions in approaching the Australian government, and his application for coming to Australia was rejected. And so that was shelved. Prabhupada was in Montreal at the time when he received that letter from Chidananda. Nevertheless, they didn't give up the idea of going to Australia. And because one devotee, Balimadan, who was at that time preaching in Tokyo with Sudama, one day he met an Australian boy at the Sunday Feast who said, "Hey, you guys should be in Australia because there's all sorts of far out things going on there. They're doing yoga and meditation." So Balimadan thought it would be nice to go to Australia. I don't know whether he knew about Chidananda's attempt, but he did eventually, because Prabhupada told him, because he wrote a letter to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, "This is a wonderful idea. We want so many temples in the South Pacific Islands, including Hawaii and New Zealand and Australia and Fiji. So it will be a great service to Lord Caitanya." He wrote that in a letter to Balimadan, "I take it for granted that you are one of the selected devotees of Lord Caitanya, and therefore from within your heart he has inspired you to go to such a distant place, leaving your parents and home just to satisfy Krishna. This is the great transcendental adventure. Try your best, and I'm sure you will be successful." So I called my book The Great Transcendental Adventure for that reason, because that was a term that came from Srila Prabhupada. Balimadan had approached Srila Prabhupada and said, "I would like to go to Australia and spread Krishna consciousness there." And Prabhupada said, "Yes, please do it, and don't make the mistakes that Chidananda did, which were to apply as a visitor." He said he would have to apply for a visa as a resident, which he did, and his visa application was accepted. So now he was going to Australia. At this point, there were no devotees in the whole of Australia, and Australia is a big place. This was the end of 1969, the beginning of 1970. So Balimadan sent a letter out to all the temple presidents at the time and said, "I'm going to Australia. Are there any devotees in your temple that are spare that you can send to help me open up a temple in Australia?" And at this time, Upendra was the temple president in Seattle, and he received this letter. And at this time, Upendra was a little depressed, and he did suffer from depression when he was a young boy, and he was a bit sad that he had to leave Prabhupada's personal service. So he wrote a letter to Srila Prabhupada, "Can I come back and be your personal servant again?" And Prabhupada said, "Yes, but you have to train up someone to do your job as a temple president." And he found someone, and he went back to Prabhupada. And one day he came, and Prabhupada, but this time was in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. This was 1969. One day he went into Prabhupada's room with this letter from Balimadan, and he said, "Srila Prabhupada, I've got a letter here from Balimadan, which he sent to me in my capacity as temple president. And he's asking me to send someone to go to Australia, but I'm not the temple president anymore. So can you suggest someone?" And Prabhupada looked at Upendra and said nothing. He just looked at Upendra, and Upendra thought, "Why is he looking at me like this?" And then he realized that Prabhupada was thinking of sending Upendra, and Prabhupada said, no, not me. I don't want to go to Australia." Prabhupada said, "You should go. You should go to Australia. You're doing better service when you were preaching as a temple president. Now, anyone can look after me and give me a massage and cook for me, but preaching is a higher service. So you should go to Australia." So Upendra all of a sudden found himself sent to Australia, and he had no money, because the immigration required at that time you to present $1,500 at immigration to show that you have some income. He just managed to scrape up the airfare, but he had no other money. So Gargamuni, who was running an import and export shop at the time, lent him the $1,500 and said, "You've got to send this back when you arrive in Australia. Promise." He said, "Yes, I promise. I'll send it back as soon as I get into the country." He didn't send it back. So then Balimadan had arrived in Australia, and Upendra joined him. And Upendra was shocked to find out that the Sydney temple was an abandoned house with broken paint glass. And Balimadan, to save rent, was staying in an abandoned house in central Sydney. with broken panes of glass, with the wind blowing through, and all Upendra found on his bed was newspaper to sleep under, like a hobo. He was very depressed and disappointed, but nevertheless, but then he said, actually, Bali Madan, I have $1,500 here that I was given from Gargamuni. Maybe we can spend this on the rent and get a proper place. And Bali Madan found a place in a little an apartment which was overlooking Sydney, and they moved in there, and that was the first official Hare Krishna temple in a place called Potts Point in Sydney, and this was 1970. So at this point, I was still going to school. Some devotees were starting to show up. It's like devotees are planted by Lord Caitanya to be born in a certain place. Prabhupada said this when he was in England, when he was sitting down with the devotees in London, and they were all sitting in his room. There was, I forget the name of the devotee in England who passed away not long ago, but he gives a very nice reminiscence about this time. Prabhupada said, now we are all together again, and you've been sent here by my Guru Maharaj to help me. And this was in England. So Prabhupada had this vision that his Guru Maharaj had arranged that all of these boys and girls were taking birth in certain places in the world, ready to pop out, just like a seed which is ready to be watered. And so the same thing happened in Australia. All these boys and girls started appearing and listening to the chanting on the street. First of all, it was Bhakta Bill, who became Upananda. And he found that he was living in an apartment just up the road from the temple. The same thing happened to Chris and Christine, Charu and Vaibhavi. And you'll hear that story tomorrow. It's an amazing story of how these devotees met Upendra, and my dad met Upendra, and I became a devotee because of Upendra, and I was just a schoolboy. And then there was Carol, who became Krishna Premi, and then there was Jan, who became Jagatarini. She was a movie star at the time. She was starring in a movie next to Mick Jagger, and she was playing the wife of a famous Australian criminal, and so she had a promising movie career ahead of her. So she was stopped on the street. She stood there listening to the kirtan. It was just Bali Madan and Upendra and Upananda at that time, 3 devotees doing chanting. One would chant and distribute literature. One would distribute literature and the other one would do kirtan, and then they would swap over. And all of these boys and girls started appearing. They were just waiting for the time for when the Sankirtan movement arrived. So she said, are you Buddhists? What are you singing? And Bali Madan said, we're chanting Hare Krishna. And he gave her a card. It was just a piece of paper with the Mahamantra on it that they printed up. And she said, well, I'll take it home, and I'm practicing singing lessons at the moment, so I'll just sing this Hare Krishna mantra. And that's another whole story, which I talk about in my book. So she became very, very interested in Krishna consciousness. But then one day she visited the temple and she saw how the devotees were living. They were just sleeping on the floor, and they had no furniture and they had no beds, and everything they owned in a locker. And she thought, I can't do this. I can't move in the temple, even though they were trying to encourage her to do so. So she decided to go to LA. And then one day, one of the devotees, she visited the temple for the last time before she got on the plane. And one of the devotees said, Prabhupada's in LA at the moment. I've got a ballpoint pen. If you see Prabhupada when you're in LA, please give him this pen. So she went to LA. She found out that all the opportunities she was dreaming of as becoming a famous movie star didn't eventuate. So one day she went to the temple, and there was Srila Prabhupada at the temple, and she handed him this pen. And she became a very, you can see a lot of the photographs of the LA Sankirtan at the time. She's there in the picture, dancing and chanting ecstatically. So all my school friend, Mahaprabhu, he brought me to the temple. And one day I was coming along, and the devotees said, look, Prabhupada's coming in 2 weeks. Prabhupada's arriving in Australia. And so it was all very exciting. It was 3 weeks, actually. And at this time, I'd finished my school. I had decided that I wanted to be a devotee. So I moved in the temple on May the 14th of this month, 50 years ago. April the 14th, I moved in the temple. And then 3 weeks later, on May the 9th, 1971, Prabhupada actually arrived in Australia. I'd moved in the temple with my school friend, and there were 16 of us living in the temple. Now, Prabhupada arrived at the temple. The night before, he spoke to Charu, who was now the temple president. He just received his name by mail as it was done in that time. He received his initiated beads and his initiated name. So Bhakta Chris became Charu. His wife was still Christine. And he said they were talking about who was going to be initiated the next day. Prabhupada said, I'll initiate everyone. Some of us had just moved in. I just moved in the temple 3 weeks before. One boy just shaved off his hair and beard the day before and moved in the temple. There was a whole batch of us, and somehow or other Prabhupada said yes. And he also said to Bhagavan, who was giving him a massage at the time, because there's a whole backstory to how Bhagavan became Prabhupada's personal servant and came to Australia with Prabhupada that same visit. And he said, and Bhagavan can also take second initiation tomorrow. So Charu was already initiated, and he was given his Gayatri mantra the next day. And Vaibhavi, his wife, received her name the next day, along with myself and a whole batch of other devotees. Some of us had just left school, and we knew nothing about spiritual life. But Prabhupada, somehow or other, due to his great mercy, he initiated everyone in the temple. And the first initiation ceremony was quite spectacular. There were devotees there who had arrived from Sweden, and there were devotees there from England, and there were the original Australian devotees.
Do you have any picture of that event, of that initiation?
Yes, we do have pictures. It's on my Facebook page. I posted them the last few days. So in the last week, there's a whole lot of pictures. I don't know whether you can bring them up on the screen now, but I certainly can't. But anyway,
Shakshi Gopal Prabhu, is it possible to bring up this picture of the initiation day, if Kurma can get it up on his screen? Shakshi Prabhu, are you there?
He has to go back a few days because I've been posting pictures of my garden.
Well, maybe it won't be possible, but still on your Facebook page.
There's the TV were there. They took a whole lot of coverage for the national TV, and Prabhupada's there arriving in the temple. He was staying in an apartment nearby that was owned by a devotee who took initiation that day, whose name is Raghunath, who's now a Buddhist priest. And I speak to him online every now and again. He's in his 70s, late 70s, probably early 80s. He was the oldest of us all, and he was 25 at the time, and we were all teenagers. We were all 17, 18, 19 years old. No one, I don't think anyone was over 20, and we didn't trust anyone over 20, as was the system. But I jest. So anyway, we took initiation that day, and Prabhupada also installed Sri Sri Radha Gopinath, and they were installed on that day. There's an amazing, astonishing story about those deities. Those deities were originally from Bombay, and one day, back in the first temple that the devotees had in 1970 in Bondi, an Indian gentleman came to the temple and he said, I have some Radha and Krishna deities that I can arrange to send. And whoever he spoke to at the time thought he was just, making a story. And they said, thank you very much. And they thought nothing about it. But he actually went and he purchased some Radha and Krishna deities, and he sent them to Birrell Street, Bondi, where the temple was at the time. By then, we had already moved temples to the one in Paddington, where Prabhupada was now situated. Those deities arrived in a box. The customs department tried to get in touch with us, but there was no forwarding address. The deities were sitting there for 6 months in the box at customs in Sydney, and then they were returned to sender back to India. And Prabhupada was the devotee that the gentleman that purchased the deities was very disappointed that the deities had come back unclaimed. So he decided to donate them to the devotees at the time. Now, the devotees at the time had arranged a Pandal program at the Cross Maidan, the famous Pandal program, where there were tens of thousands of people attending. And these deities were installed in the Pandal and in front of Srila Prabhupada. And they took up the whole program there with Arati, and Jamuna was there doing the deity worship. And there's a whole backstory. And these deities were then brought to Australia for the second time by Bhagavan and Bali Madan. They were wrapped up in a cloth, and if you see those original photographs, you'll see the Radha Gopinath have come back to Australia. They really wanted to come back. So for the second time, they took a journey. This time they were in a Boeing 707. Previously, they were on a boat, but they finally, Radha Gopinath finally made it to Sydney, and then they were installed on that day by Srila Prabhupada. And they're still in Sydney Temple today, looking wonderful and beautiful. You can see their picture on my Facebook page, and their 50th anniversary festival is going on starting in 2 days' time in Sydney for 5-day festival.
So tell us about the initiation day, and tell us something about how Srila Prabhupada came in and what did he do, and tell us how you felt that day.
Well, we were all at the airport, and we all were greeting Srila Prabhupada at the airport, and we were all delirious and ecstatic and nervous. None of us had seen Prabhupada. Charu said when he paid his obeisances on the floor, he was so delirious with excitement that he gave himself a mild concussion by bashing his head, and he was almost unconscious for the rest of the day. The ladies prostrated themselves on the airport floor and didn't get up. You can see a picture of Prabhupada looking down. He's looking down at the Matajis who didn't know what they're supposed to do after they offered their dandabats. And devotees had to come up to them and say, "You can stand up now," because they were blocking every path. And we were all ecstatic. We had a kirtan. There was a press conference. Prabhupada spoke some things in the press conference, which I've mentioned in my book. And then he got into the car, which was just the temple Volkswagen van. It was a big step up, and they had to help Prabhupada up. And Bhagavan and Bali Madan were still carrying the deities at this time. Prabhupada drove to Paddington, which was where the temple was, which Paddington is now a very, very trendy suburb of Sydney. But by that time, it was a very rundown inner city suburb. We were right opposite the army barracks on Oxford Street in Paddington. In those days, we thought that it was the right thing to do to get a shopfront temple, because everyone was getting a shopfront temple. So we thought that's what a temple is. It has to be a shopfront. So they did that in Germany, and they did it in so many places. So we got a shopfront, and we were all bowing down, paying obeisances on the floor, and Prabhupada walked over to the temple door, pushed the door, but the wind had blown the door closed, and he couldn't get in. My father and mother had very, very reluctantly come to the temple that morning on my insistence to meet Prabhupada, and my father looked through the curtain and saw that Prabhupada was on the other side of the door, and my father very graciously opened the door for Srila Prabhupada. That was his first devotional service. And so he let Srila Prabhupada into the temple. Prabhupada glanced at him for a moment and gave him a smile of encouragement. And then Prabhupada entered the room, and he realized at this stage that we were very unprepared. He sat down for the jagya, but he noticed many things were missing. There were no flowers on the altar. There were no proper utensils. We didn't know a thing. And it had all happened so quickly that the devotees that had come with Prabhupada didn't have a chance to tell us, you need suchi utensils. Prabhupada wanted a bowl to put the ghee in, and we didn't have a bowl. So someone ran downstairs to where we kept our eating bowls, little plastic eating bowls where we had our breakfast cereal, and they gave Prabhupada a plastic eating bowl. Prabhupada sent it away and said, no, it has to be something suchi. So we were all running around like crazy fellows trying to get things done. There was all sorts of equipment actually that they had brought in for the jagya, but it was locked in the office, and the devotee had the key to the office, was sitting down at the Jagya pit, and he left his key behind. So Deepak, who was there at the time, who had come from LA, had to smash the office door down to try to get things. And it was a scene of devastation. And meanwhile, the press were filming everything, and hundreds of guests were there in this tiny little room, and it was a very hot day, and they were lighting a fire. All off.
I
Anyway.
have to stop you. I have to stop you for a moment. You are an absolutely wonderful storyteller. I mean, the way you're talking, I can see it in my mind's eye. Anyway, go ahead. Continue. I'm just enthralled by this.
Okay. Well, I have told the story a few times. So, so anyway, Prabhupada, then he called everybody up. There were 16 devotees sitting around the fire pit. And the first devotee to come up, his name was Willie. His name was Willie Pfantner. And he had been a hippie that had crossed over, he hitchhiked all the way from Sweden to India with his friend Jürgen Sundvall. And Jürgen and his wife Marion had gone to India, whereas Willie had decided to stay in Sydney. Willie joined the temple, and he was sitting there in front of the fire pit with Srila Prabhupada, whereas his friend Jürgen and Marion, they had met Prabhupada in Bombay, and they got married at the Cross Maidan festival, and they were initiated in front of 30,000 people and married in front of 30,000 people. And you can see that actually on film. And then Prabhupada invited Bhagavan to come back to Australia with his wife to be his servant. So Bhagavan was there, and Marian had not yet come to Australia because she didn't have a visa. She was Padmapati, Devi Dasi. She joined later on. So Willie came up, and Prabhupada chanted one round on his beads. And then he said, he asked him where he was from, and he said, well, I'm from Sweden. And Prabhupada was fascinated. And there was a long conversation. What's it like in Sweden? Does it get cold? Does it snow? And what are you doing in Australia? And he said, and he told a little story, how he got to be there. Prabhupada was genuinely interested in, and he said, your name is Ajit, which means Ajit Das. This was the original Ajit Das from Sweden. And he went on, actually, later on to translate Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita into Swedish. And he's now living in Sweden, and he's online on Facebook. And then a number of devotees came up, and then Christine came up, and she was given the name Krishna Premi. She became a famous singer. She recorded some beautiful CDs back in the day. She was always crying, always crying. She was crying that day. She was crying every day that Prabhupada was there. So Prabhupada said, your name is Krishna Premi. You can cry for Krishna. So then so many devotees came up. I came up, and Prabhupada asked me what was my name, and I said, it's Philip. And he said, how old are you? I mean, I was 18, and I told Prabhupada I was 18, but I felt like I was 14, really. I was a very young 18. I didn't know anything about life, and so I was a very immature lad. But somehow or other, I had decided to come to the temple, and my parents actually had driven me when I joined the temple 3 weeks before. They'd actually helped me pack my bags and helped me come to the temple, and they dropped me off, and my mother was crying, but they left me, and I stayed. So I went up, and Prabhupada said, your name is Kurma Das. You're the servant of Kurma. Kurma is the transcendental tortoise. And then there were a couple of girls who were schoolgirls, Govinda Mohini and Govinda Nandini. They were schoolgirls at one of the local colleges, the local Catholic schools. They came up, and then Vaibhavi came up, and Prabhupada gave her name, but she said that Prabhupada told me my name, but it sounded like Boy Bubby, Boybubbby. And she said, my name is Boy Bubby. And she said, but that can't be right. And she later found out that her name was Vaibhavi, but Prabhupada was speaking with a very deep Bengali voice. And so it sounded like Boy Bubby. So for a little while, she was boy Bubby, and then she found out she was Bubby. And there was a devotee called Deepak who had been a pujari in Los Angeles, and he had been sent to Australia to help us. He was already initiated. Deepak was there, and he got married that day to a devotee called Nartaki, who was a tourist coming from Germany. Her name was Renate. And one day Renate was getting off the bus when I was getting off the same bus. I was coming from school and she was coming from work. And she said, "Excuse me, do you know where the Hare Krishna temple is?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going there now. I'll take you." So she joined, and Renate got the name Nartaki Devi Dasi, who's now
so Nartaki was initiated on that day.
Mm-hmm.
Because she and I did sankirtana an awful lot together.
Not Nartaka Gopal. It's a different Nartaki.
No, this is just Nartaki. Didn't she eventually move to Los Angeles?
Maybe.
I think
She has a German
I think so.
She has a German accent, very strong German accent, and that's Nartaki. She's now living in Bombay, and she's a nurse, I think, at the Bhaktivedanta hospital. So Nartaki joined, and she was initiated, and she was married to Deepak at the time. So they got married. There was a marriage ceremony. I think there were 2 marriages, and I think Charu married Vaibhavi on that day. And there was another boy who had just shaved off his beard the day before, and he became Bhajanabi. And then my friend Mark became Mahaprabhu. And then Prabhupada did the installation of the deities. He actually installed the deities first, and then he gave us the initiations. Those deities are still worshipped there in Sydney. And beautiful Radha Gopinath. Prabhupada named them Radha Gopinath on that day. And then he performed the arati ceremony. And then we had the initiations. The fire was lit. The hot room was even hotter, and the smoke was rising, and people were opening the doors and suffocating in the heat and the smoke. But it was all part of the transcendental wonder of the day. And
an
then
amazing story.
And then that was just day one, and Prabhupada spent. There was the picture of Prabhupada arriving at the airport. There's me standing behind Charu. You can see that I've got a head like a pointy-headed alien. You can see half of my head there. And there's Charu at the front with his hands in pranam. You'll be speaking to him tomorrow. And then there's Bhajanabi from New Zealand behind him. And then there's a devotee with his hands together holding a madanga. He got initiated as Acharya Das. I lost touch with him. I don't know what happened to him. And there's a policeman standing there on the left. And there's a little boy, Radha Raman, on the right, who was the son of Raghunath, who got initiated that day. And there's a devotee called Hari Ramadas on the far right with his head down. And Prabhupada's looking down, and he's looking down at Rasarani and Rishabh Devi and all the other ladies who were prostrating themselves in the airport. And he was waiting for them to get up, and they were waiting to know what to do next. And so that moment was captured in time.
Beautiful.
There should be some more pictures there. I don't know whether Gopal can bring them up. But it was a wonderful day. It was a memorable day. It was a lot of it was on film, and we finally got those films from the archives. You can see that the day of Prabhupada's arriving outside the temple, and some of the footage, and pictures were taken, and eventually they all surfaced some years later. Prabhupada's a wonderful week in Sydney for that first visit. Prabhupada consequently went on to visit Australia 6 times. So he did 1971, 72, 73, 74, 75, and 76. He liked Australia a great deal. We had our reunion of Prabhupada's disciples starting in 1992, and then we had a second one in 1996, and we had a third one in 2011, and we've got the 50th anniversary festival coming up in a few days. At that first reunion, devotees said to me, all this information is going to get lost. You have to write all this down. So I took on the task of writing this book, The Great Transcendental Adventure, which is 800 pages of Prabhupada's transcendental pastimes in Australia, and it's well worth reading. There's Ajit, whose name was Bhaktivedanta, and he's getting Prabhupada's chanting on his beads. and he's sitting there in front of the fire pit, which was very bare, as you can see. There were no fruit, there were no flowers. Devotees had to run and go and buy flowers while the yajna was going on, and it was a Sunday and everything was closed. So the ladies had to run down the highway to try to find any shops that were selling flowers at the time. They managed to get one bunch of carnations. So Bhakti Vilifantna became initiated as Jajitas, and that's a beautiful picture there, and Prabhupada's bestowing his mercy on Ajit. And that's Bali Madan on the left.
Beautiful.
And so, yes, many pastimes, many transcendental pastimes. Prabhupada took great pains to come to Australia. It's a very, very long way from Bombay, and Prabhupada was already in his late 70s, and it was inconvenient for Srila Prabhupada, but he took that. He took it upon himself to share the Mahaprabhu's mercy on us all.
Wow, such a wonderful time to just listen to you and to just get this description that clearly started to develop almost a picture in my mind. We really appreciate it. You're an excellent storyteller. I am going to get that book. I haven't read it, and I don't own the book, but I'll get it. So thank you so much. Oh, some more pictures. Okay.
Yeah, that's Bhagavan opening the door for Prabhupada, getting in or out of the car. I think he's getting into the car after the program. Prabhupada couldn't reach the chair, and so they had to lift him into the chair to sit in the Volkswagen Kombi van. That's in Oxford Street in Paddington, which is the building is still there, but it's now a clothing boutique. But Radha and Gopinath were installed there, and Prabhupada touched down. There's a number of very wonderful places that Prabhupada has sanctified with his lotus feet in Sydney by his transcendental visits over the years. Bhagavan is living in Sweden right now, and he's a Facebook friend of mine. And yes, so a lot of mercy.
So you stay in touch with many of the devotees of your beginnings of Krishna consciousness, huh?
I do, yes. I stay in touch with whoever's still living and contactable. A few of them are disappeared, a few of them have passed away, and but whoever's on Facebook, I definitely keep in touch, and on email as well. And you'll be speaking to Jeru tomorrow, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
and
yes.
He'll tell you his wonderful story of how he came to Krishna consciousness. Miraculous coincidences, which were not coincidences at all. He also found himself living right near the temple, even though he'd just landed in Sydney with his girlfriend at the time, and they just randomly rented this place, which was just near the temple. And so all these amazing events took place where devotees suddenly found themselves meeting Upendra on the street. I mean, I owe my spiritual life to Upendra. And many devotees owe their spiritual life to Upendra and Bali Madan. So these devotees have engaged in wonderful transcendental pastimes to bring others to Krishna consciousness. Upendra, of course, passed away some years back, and but we brought him back to Australia to pass away from his hepatitis C that he had, and he passed away in the association of the devotees, with devotees having kirtan. There's Bhagavan on the left in this picture. There's Churu on the right. There's Raghunath holding his daughter on the second to the right, and there's Bali Madan standing looking up. So classic pictures.
Okay, Prabhu. Thank you so very much. Wonderful time spent with you. I'm just very happy that you have given us your time, and I'd like to stay more in touch with you if that would be okay.
Sure. Hare Krishna.
Yes.
Very much.
Glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.
Glories to Srila Prabhupada on his 50th anniversary of arriving in Sydney. Hare Bol.
Hare Bol.